Final Fantasy Tactics. What a game. Truly a gem in Square's already bedazzled crown. As the title suggests, it's a tactical RPG, but it's also something much more than that. For many of us, this game was the first time that we were challenged to think about complex political systems, battlefield strategy, and the high cost of war. All of it is elevated by a stunning musical score composed by Hitoshi Sakimoto and Masaharu Iwata. And yes, I'm calling it a score rather than a soundtrack, and there's a reason for that, which we'll get to. These two composers are masterful collaborators. Together, they conceived a musical identity for Tactics that captures everything from fantasy to military might to personal tragedy. Big strings, regal brass, dark motifs, just what you'd expect to convey drama and betrayal. But what makes it work? Why does the music in Tactics hit harder than so many of its peers? The answer, I think, lies in you, the player. See, Tactics doesn't just tell you a story about a war. It makes you live it. Not just through cutscenes or dialogue, but in the mechanics themselves. When you recruit a new unit, you give them a name, you assign them a job, you build out their skill trees, and you shape them into something unique. Individuals. They're not just pawns, they're your soldiers, your squad, your team. And then one day you lose one. Not in a cutscene, not for the story, but because of a misstep, a risky move, a poor decision. And when that timer hits 0, they're just gone, forever. Maybe you still win the battle, but you leave something behind. That is the cost of war. This function is pretty common in the genre, and yeah, you can just reload your save, but man does it hurt. And our composers understand this, and that's why we get tracks like Bloody Excrement. Yes, that's the real title. This one was composed by Sakimoto, and it starts like this. Right away, we're in the thick of it. Big percussion, low strings grinding just beneath the surface, leaving your imagination to stress about what types of enemy units weren't immediately visible in that first camera pan. The first few seconds alone tell you, lives are on the line. This is the sound of stepping onto the battlefield and scanning the fog of war. But later, in the same track, something else happens. There's a big shift. The battle recedes into a type of eerie stillness. There's a sense of uncomfortable, heavy space, like holding your breath, the unmistakable feeling of dread. But war isn't only death and dread, right? There's also glory, heroism, and valor. You can hear it in tracks like Attack Team, this time composed by Masaharu Iwata. This cue combines that militant energy with a sense of growing heroism. Rather than mourning the battle, it's kind of excited for it. This is a perfect example of why Sakimoto and Iwata make such a good team. They don't just understand the assignment, they wrote the dissertation. If you have a sharp ear, you can start to tell their styles apart. But what's really impressive is just how seamlessly their work blends into one unified voice. The score often doesn't feel like it was written by two people, but rather the product of a shared vision. It's dual genius, one language spoken by two masters. To round it out, let's listen to one more. This is the Game Over theme, composed by Hitoshi Sakimoto. What a masterful blend of sadness and foreboding. It feels almost like mourning the loss of a loved one, which is a common theme throughout Tactics, but this kind of goes beyond that. This is the premature end of an important story that would shape the history of Ivalice. The reason that I think of this as more than just an OST is because it feels like an earnest attempt at proper scoring, and I would call it successful. The streamed audio cues that accompany the FMVs are clearly more in line with film scoring than the in-game tracks, but even so, we have to give credit where it's due here. The Final Fantasy franchise up to this point was known for its catchy hooks and melody-centered music. Nobuo Uematsu in particular wasn't writing cinematic scores, he was mostly leaning into a rock and pop writing style, with a heavy focus on melody and predictable structures, which served the medium extremely well. The man's a genius, we all know that. But Hitoshi Sakimoto and Masaharu Iwata are composing in a very different way. While Uematsu's One-Winged Angel was a bit of a rock opera, Iwata and Sakimoto's work on Tactics is clearly very orchestra-centered and a little bit less predictable structurally, seemingly finding inspiration in film score composers of their youth, like John Williams or Jerry Goldsmith. For this reason, I like to bestow the title of score on the Tactics OST, despite it not really being the technically correct term. I would be remiss, of course, if I neglected to highlight the specific hardware that was used to create this fantastic score, but first, let's give some love to a few people who don't get nearly enough recognition in this space. Hidenori Suzuki, sound programmer, Motoko Watanabe, sound engineer, and mixing recording engineer Kenji Nagashima. All three of these legends are equally responsible for the sonic profile of Final Fantasy Tactics, and don't receive the fanfare they deserve. Along with sound design, at least one of these three was most likely responsible for importing the instrument samples from their original hardware into the game data. The way these samples are utilized by the PS1 sound chip, along with that classic reverb, plays a huge part in why this soundtrack is so hard-hitting and memorable. Imagine making full orchestrations with these dinky samples and still impressing the hell out of your friends and fans. The original hardware in question is almost exclusively the JV1080, which, as many of you know from my previous video, is my favorite piece of music hardware. However, Final Fantasy Tactics makes extensive use of the SR-JV80 orchestral expansion board, with a bit of the world expansion as well. Here are a couple of the stock JV1080 patches in action. Hey everyone, so interestingly, several hours later, I was messing around with my Sound Canvas SC88 Pro, and I realized that a bunch of the sounds from Final Fantasy Tactics are in that thing. So that's another way you can get those sounds if you want. Surprise, I didn't know that when I started making this video. So a little post-research research. Yeah, hope that helps. I don't have the orchestral expansion card myself yet. It's a little on the expensive side, ranging anywhere from $50 to $120 US depending on who you buy from. And because they're no longer being manufactured, your only real option is secondhand, which can be hit or miss, trust me. Not to mention, you need to have something to put the expansion card into, so if you don't already own a JV1080 or other compatible hardware, you're looking at hundreds of dollars just to use these sounds. Fortunately, there are other, much more accessible options. Roland Cloud, for example, offers software versions of the JV1080, as well as its expansions in the form of the SRX series, such as Orchestral and World, and these contain the original uncompressed versions of the very same instrument sounds you just heard. As a fun little demonstration, I've transcribed my favorite piece of music from the entire Final Fantasy Tactics soundtrack, Trisection, and created a sort of uncompressed version. Oh, and let me know in the comments whether you think this one was composed by Hitoshi Sakimoto or Masaharu Iwata. So as you can see, this is made in FL Studio, and I used a bunch of instances of Roland SRX Orchestra, as well as a few instances of this, Galaxius. I'll take you through a couple of the instruments just to show you what I did here. We'll start with this bell, because it's very simple. It's just kind of one roughly one note or so at a time. This is Galaxius. This is from Roland Cloud. It's sort of a container for multiple plugins at once, kind of. So you can kind of mix and match them. You can create your own patches. You can do like performance patches, things like that. It's got mixer, it's got effects, etc. So as you can see here, I've got SRX Orchestra with the Tubular Bells as one patch. And then I've got XV5080 with the Beauty Bells patch. I'll just mute the XV5080 so that you can hear the SRX Orchestra patch, which is just a pretty simple tubular bell. And I've got this effect on it called Pulse Verb. Pretty cool. And then on the XV5080, I have this EQ here taking out a bunch of the highs because I found this patch to be very kind of sparkly and tinny, but I really liked what it was doing in the mid and low. So this is what it sounds like. It does sound very synthy and artificial, but I thought that it kind of like enriched the overall sound. So when you put them together, you get a nice little sound there. And then this is what you would hear throughout the song. Coming down to some of these strings, these are all just various patches within SRX Orchestra. And I'll just go ahead and solo this one track here so you can hear. It's going to be these three instruments kind of playing along with one another so you can sort of hear what it sounds like together. Yeah, these sound really great. These are the actual samples that would have been compressed and put into Final Fantasy Tactics. They actually came from, these are the same samples, but in their uncompressed form that you would have gotten from the SRJV expansion board. This is a very high quality sort of, uncompressed option for recreating this kind of music or composing your own stuff this way. Real quick, I want to show this timpani and snare thing I've got going on here. So the snare is pretty simple. It's just a regular snare patch. Sounds like this. And then here I've got this timpani. And the cool thing about this timpani is that it's another one that's made in Galaxius. So I've got the SRX Orchestra once again, and I've got this 4-way timps patch, and then I've got a JV1080 in here with ceremony timp. So these two things put together make a really nice, big, militaristic sounding percussion. So just to show you what they sound like by themselves, SRX Orchestra's patch sounds like this. And then the JV1080 patch sounds like this. Much bigger and heavier. And on the JV1080, I've got this EQ. Taking out pretty much everything in the middle and just leaving a little bit up top and a little bit down at the bottom because I just want it for that boominess. Right? When you put these two sounds together, you get a nice big. And here's the pattern. So yeah, nice big full battle drums like you want to hear. And then here I've got these string lows, which is another Galaxius patch that I put together. I didn't want to overdo it. You can do up to 4 plugins within Galaxius, which is pretty cool. You can make some really interesting sounds, or you can use it for performance. But for the purposes of what I was doing, I kind of wanted to keep it a little simple because this is retro game music. There's a limit to the number of notes that could be played at once and the number of timbres that you would hear at a time. So it seems like more authentic, even in an uncompressed form, to use fewer instruments. So here we've got Dynamark SRX and we've got Bright Strings. And these are for the low, pretty bassy string section here. And this is one of my favorite parts of the whole piece. Yeah, that's a really great stringy bass sound there. And here's all of it together. As you can see, Roland Cloud comes with a huge library of classic sounds that you'll definitely recognize from your favorite games of yesteryear. If that sounds like something that interests you, you can get a 30-day free trial of Roland Cloud Ultimate at rolandcloud.com/memberships. I love video game music of this era so much that I decided to make a VST inspired by it. It's called GuyEngine. It features over 500 instruments, all inspired by the very specific texture of video game music from the 90s and early 2000s. It's updated regularly and even contains over 60 presets based specifically on Final Fantasy Tactics, which are taken directly from my Tactical Fantasy Guy sound font. In summation, Final Fantasy Tactics is a game and a story about the toll that war takes on all of us. And the soundtrack perfectly encapsulates that. This was the game that introduced me to Hitoshi Sakimoto and Masaharu Iwata's work, and I've been a massive fan ever since. When I was first learning how to compose music, I studied this soundtrack incessantly, hoping to be able to capture even a fraction of the magic that they have time and again. What game did that for you? If you enjoyed this video and love video game music as much as I do, please hit that subscribe button to see more stuff like this in the future. Finally, a big ol' thank you to my wonderful patrons: Justin Hawes, Devox, Allo, Ethan Isaiah Kirshner, Irian, SampleText64, Dean, Sami Michaela, Cryonic Sage 7719, Scruffington, Selena, and Pineapple Man. Thank you all. See you next time.